Story number 1.
I had never been one to believe in ghosts or anything that couldn't be explained by logic. I always thought that supernatural stories were just that, stories. But that before I spent one night in the old Miller house. It was a chilly November evening when my friend Laura invited me to spend the weekend with her and her fiance Matt at a house they just bought on the outskirts of town. It was a beautiful two-story house surrounded by dense trees, a perfect place for the three of us to unwind and relax. Laura had mentioned that the house was a little older than most, but she was excited about the charm it had. As a fan of history, I was excited as well, though I had to admit I felt a slight unease when we arrived. The house was much bigger than I had imagined, with long, narrow hallways and creaky wooden floors. It was the kind of house that seemed to have its own presence, like it was alive in some way. But that was just my mind playing tricks on me. I chalked it up to the stormy weather and the strange feeling of being in an unfamiliar place. We arrived late in the evening, so after a brief tour of the house, we decided to settle in for the night. Laura and Matt took the master bedroom while I was given a small guest room on the second floor. The room was cozy, with a view of the dark woods outside. As I lay down on the bed, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows. It was a typical autumn night. I closed my eyes, attempting to drift off to sleep, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I felt like I was being watched. The feeling was subtle at first, just a faint sense of unease. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head and burying my face in the pillow, but the sensation only grew stronger. It wasn't just a feeling of being watched, it was as if something was waiting for me to fall asleep. I finally sat up in bed, heart racing. I was alone in the room, but I felt like I wasn't. I turned toward the window, hoping to see the comforting sight of the trees swaying in the wind, but instead, I saw something different. There, in the reflection of the glass, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. A tall, thin figure, its face obscured by shadows. My blood ran cold. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I stared at the window, my mind racing. Was I imagining things? I had to be. The storm was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After a few moments of stillness, I tried to lie back down, convincing myself it was just a product of my imagination. I kept my eyes closed, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. It was as if something was moving in the room, circling around me, waiting. I finally couldn't take it any longer. I got up, grabbed my phone from the bedside table, and texted Laura. "Hey, is everything okay? I'm feeling kind of weird in here." A few seconds later, she replied, "Everything's fine. Just relax. I'm sure it's nothing. Try to get some sleep." I stared at the message, my fingers trembling. She didn't understand. I wasn't sure I did either, but the room didn't feel safe. I was about to text her back when I heard it. A soft sound like a whisper coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but then it came again. A low, murmuring voice, almost too faint to hear, but distinct enough to make my skin crawl. "Get out." My heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening. The whisper came again, louder this time, and it was definitely coming from outside my door. "Get out. Get out of here." I shot up from the bed and hurried to the door, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. I threw open the door, half expecting to see Laura or Matt, but the hallway was empty. The dim light from the living room cast long shadows on the walls. I stood there, my pulse pounding in my ears. The air in the hallway was cold, far colder than the rest of the house. I shivered, pulling the collar of my sweater tight around my neck. The whispering had stopped, but the eerie silence in the hallway was deafening. I stepped cautiously toward the stairs that led to the first floor. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the darkness swallowing up the corners of the house. I reached the bottom, my eyes scanning the room, but there was no sign of anyone. Matt and Laura's voices came from the kitchen, the sound of them laughing softly as they chatted. I walked toward them, still shaken, and found them sitting at the kitchen table, a bottle of wine between them. "You okay?" Laura asked when she saw me standing in the doorway. I don't know. Something's off about this place," I said, my voice shaky. Matt raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I keep hearing things, whispers, and I'm not sure, but I think I saw someone in my room earlier." Laura gave me a look that I couldn't quite interpret. You sure it wasn't just the storm messing with your head? It's really windy out there. I wanted to believe her. I did. But something inside me told me it was more than that. The air in the house felt heavy, as though it was filled with something unseen. Maybe I'll just take a walk outside for a bit, I said, trying to shake the feeling. Get some fresh air. Laura nodded. All right, but don't be gone too long. It's getting late. I stepped outside, the chill of the night air cutting through my sweater. The house was silent behind me, the only sound the rustling of the trees in the wind. I walked around the yard trying to clear my mind, but my thoughts kept returning to the strange whispers and the figure I'd seen in the window. Something was wrong with the house. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it deep in my bones. As I walked further away from the house, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the creak of the front door slowly opening. I spun around, expecting to see Laura or Matt, but the house was still dark. I started to walk back toward the cabin, my steps quickening as the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't help it. As I turned my head, I saw a figure standing in the window. It was the same figure from earlier, tall, thin, and cloaked in shadows. This time, though, it was different. The figure wasn't just standing there. It was moving, slowly pacing back and forth in front of the window. I broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pounded back toward the door. When I reached it, I flung it open, nearly slamming it into the wall behind me. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me. "Laura!" I shouted, my voice high with panic. "Matt, we need to leave. Now!" They both stared at me, their faces pale. They hadn't heard the door open, hadn't seen the figure in the window. But that wasn't the worst part. From upstairs, we heard it again, a whisper, faint at first but growing louder. "Get out!" This time, it didn't stop. The voice continued, louder and louder until it was no longer a whisper. It was a scream. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" And that's when I realized it wasn't a warning. It was a command. The door to the guest room slammed open. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was the dead of night when Thomas finally turned onto the narrow, winding road that led to the old farmstead. He had been driving for over 2 hours, his tires crunching against the gravel as the headlights barely cut through the thick darkness. The farm was well beyond the reach of any towns or villages, a place that had been abandoned long before he had moved to this part of the country. No one really talked about it anymore, but it was there, always there, looming just outside of town. Thomas had heard the stories. Everyone who grew up around here had a tale to tell about the old farm. Some claimed the house was cursed. Others said it was the spirits of the former residents that refused to leave. They said if you were foolish enough to go there at night, you'd feel it, the oppressive weight in the air, the unseen eyes watching from the darkened windows. But Thomas had always scoffed at those stories. He wasn't one for superstition, not after everything he'd seen in his years of working as a paramedic in a busy city. Yet, on this night, something had drawn him here. Something in the air, something about the way the wind howled through the trees, made him think he needed to see this place with his own eyes. His headlights illuminated the dilapidated structure ahead. The farmhouse stood like a hulking shadow against the starless sky. Its roof caved in, windows shattered, and the paint peeling from the weather-beaten wood. The fence around the property had long since fallen into ruin, and the tall grass and weeds swayed as though they were alive in the night. The truck rolled to a stop at the foot of the driveway. For a moment, Thomas just sat there, staring at the house. His heart rate had picked up, and an unfamiliar unease settled over him. It was as if the house was pulling him in, a force stronger than his common sense, stronger than his disbelief in ghosts. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the feeling, but it lingered. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the truck. The air was colder here, biting at his skin, and there was a strange stillness in the atmosphere. Not a single animal made a sound. The wind seemed to be holding its breath. His boots crunched as he made his way up the overgrown path toward the porch. The front door was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. He hesitated, the familiar sense of doubt creeping in. What was he doing here? It was late, and there was no reason to be poking around an abandoned house, especially one with such a dark reputation. but the curiosity was overwhelming. Taking a deep breath, Thomas pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside the house was musty, thick with the smell of decay. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, and the dim light from his flashlight danced across the walls, revealing faded wallpaper and old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. As he moved deeper into the house, the temperature dropped even further. It was so cold that he could see his breath in the beam of the flashlight. The living room, what had once been the heart of the home, was now a graveyard of broken furniture. An overturned chair lay near the center of the room, its backrest cracked in half. The remnants of a broken table were scattered across the floor, and a cold fireplace sat unused, the blackened remnants of past fires still visible in the grate. As he stepped further into the house, his mind replayed the stories he had heard as a child. How the previous owners had mysteriously disappeared, how people claimed to hear footsteps in the house at night even though no one had lived there in years. He laughed at himself, trying to brush the feeling of unease away. This was ridiculous. It was just an old house, a place that had been abandoned for years. Yet, the weight of silence in the house seemed almost oppressive. The air felt thick, as though it was holding something back, something waiting. There was a sudden thud from upstairs. Thomas froze. His heart skipped a beat, and for a split second he thought about leaving. It was probably just the house settling, but the sound had been too distinct, too deliberate. His instincts screamed at him to turn around and walk out, but something else, something darker, urged him to climb the stairs. With a deep breath, he turned toward the staircase. The stairs creaked under his weight as he ascended, the flashlight illuminating the top of the stairs and the long, dark hallway. A strange feeling of vertigo washed over him, as if the house itself were shifting, tilting slightly, disorienting him. His breath became shallow as he moved further down the hall, the light flickering at the edges of his vision. At the end of the hallway was a door. Unlike the others in the house, it was closed. A simple wooden door, plain and unremarkable, but something about it called to him. He felt an inexplicable pull, an urge to open it. He stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. The door swung open with a groan. The room inside was a bedroom. The bed frame had long since fallen apart and the sheets had rotted away, but there was something about the room that struck him. The walls were covered in old photographs, faded black and white images of people he didn't recognize. A couple, a family. And then there it was, a picture of a young girl standing alone in front of the house, smiling. But her eyes, they weren't right. They were too wide, too dark, almost hollow. It was as though the photo had captured something else, something hidden within the girl's gaze. Thomas felt a sudden cold draft, his breath coming out in sharp bursts. He turned away from the picture, but the room seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. The floorboards creaked, and he felt a presence behind him. It wasn't just the house settling anymore. He slowly turned his head, and for the briefest moment he thought he saw something, a figure, standing in the doorway, just beyond the reach of his flashlight's beam. The shape was tall, obscured by the darkness, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. His heart pounded in his chest. "Maggie?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. He hadn't meant to say the name aloud, but it slipped out before he could stop it. Maggie had been his wife, the one person he had lost a few months ago in a tragic car accident. Her death had shattered him, and he had never quite recovered. He had come here, seeking something, anything that could explain the strange sense of loss he carried. The figure in the doorway didn't respond. Instead, it took a step forward, and Thomas saw the glint of light reflecting off something. A knife, perhaps? His blood ran cold. He spun around, his body shaking with fear. There was nothing there. The room was empty. The photographs on the wall had begun to blur, their images twisting as though they were alive, shifting before his eyes. The cold draft intensified, and suddenly a voice, soft and distant, whispered his name. "Thomas." It was Maggie's voice. Without thinking, he bolted for the stairs. He heard footsteps behind him, heavy and slow, but when he glanced over his shoulder, the hall was empty. The weight of something terrible pressed in on him, urging him to leave, to escape. His feet flew down the stairs, and he rushed toward the front door. The door, which had been slightly ajar when he arrived, was now wide open, as if waiting for him. He slammed the door shut behind him and bolted to his truck. The engine roared to life, and he sped down the gravel driveway, not daring to look back. He didn't stop driving until he was well past the town, his heart still racing. That night, as Thomas lay in bed, trying to push the memories of the farmhouse from his mind, he heard it again, soft, almost imperceptible, the whisper of his name. Thomas. He knew it wasn't over. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I've never been one to believe in ghosts, not even after what happened to me that night. But I can't explain it, and I know I'm not the same since that night. There's something in me that's different, and it's all because of what I saw in the dead of night. It all started when I took a weekend trip to a cabin in the woods. I needed some time alone to clear my head after a rough patch in my personal life. I found a place on a rental website, a secluded, rustic cabin miles from the nearest town. No phone signal, no distractions, just nature, silence, and me. The cabin was older than I expected, with creaky floors and a smell of old wood that seemed to press in on me when I walked through the door. But it was peaceful, the kind of peace I had been craving. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set. The drive there had been quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the trees along the road. By the time I got settled in, the sky had turned dark and the wind had picked up, shaking the trees outside. I decided to light a fire in the fireplace, curl up with a book, and wait for the night to pass. The house was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the occasional howling wind outside. It felt like I had the whole world to myself. Around midnight, I finished my book and turned off the light. The cabin had no electricity, just lamps and candles, so I had already settled into bed by the time I noticed something strange. It was a sound, faint at first, but it gradually grew louder. A tapping coming from somewhere outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe the trees brushing against the cabin, but the sound seemed too deliberate, too rhythmic to be natural. Tap, tap, tap. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But after a while, it became impossible to pretend it wasn't happening. The tapping didn't stop. It only got louder and more insistent. It wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the porch. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a possum, pawing at the wood. But the tapping was too rhythmic, too precise. It felt deliberate, like someone was knocking. I was torn between curiosity and fear. I didn't want to go outside, not in the dead of night. But the sound, it was almost as if it was calling to me. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door cautiously, stepping onto the porch. The wind had picked up and the trees were swaying violently, but everything else was silent. The porch was empty, just a few scattered leaves and the empty rocking chair. No sign of anyone or anything that might have made the noise. I stood there for a moment, scanning the yard, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The tapping had stopped. I took a deep breath, feeling stupid for even considering that there was something out there. Maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe the wind had caused some strange acoustics that I had misinterpreted. But just as I was about to step back inside, I heard it again. Tap, 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 tap. This time it came from behind me. Slowly I turned around. Standing just at the edge of the porch, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. It wasn't close, just far enough that I couldn't make out details, but I could feel its presence. It was tall, too tall to be human, with long limbs and a shape that didn't quite look right. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest and I could barely breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but it was there, watching. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I could only stand there, trembling. The tapping started again, but this time it wasn't on the porch. It was coming from the direction of the figure, as though it were moving closer. Tap, tap, tap. I stumbled backward, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against the wood, trying to steady my breathing. The tapping stopped again, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going away. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the light on and the fire blazing in the hearth, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made my skin crawl. I kept expecting to hear the tapping again, but it never came. The next morning, I rushed to pack up my things, desperate to leave. I was shaken to my core, but I didn't want to face the reality of what I had seen. So I told myself it had been a nightmare, or just my mind playing tricks on me. I drove back home, my heart still racing, but I convinced myself it was over. The incident had been nothing more than a result of stress and isolation. I thought that was the end of it. But that night, as I lay in bed at home, trying to forget the events of the cabin, I heard the tapping again. It was faint at first, just a gentle tapping at the edge of my awareness. I brushed it off, convincing myself that it was the sound of something mundane, maybe a neighbor or an old pipe in the walls. But as the tapping grew louder, it became undeniable. It was coming from outside my window. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel my blood running cold. The figure from the night before, the one I had convinced myself was a hallucination, was back. The tapping wasn't just a sound. It was a message, and it wasn't done with me. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the window, pulling the blinds back just enough to peek outside. There was nothing there. The yard was empty, just the normal suburban landscape I had lived in for years. Nothing unusual, no tall, loud, shadowy figures standing in the dark. But the tapping didn't stop. It was coming from inside the room now, from somewhere behind me. Tap, tap, tap. I spun around. The room was empty, of course, but the sound was getting louder, closer. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, saw it. In the corner of my room, just out of sight, there was a dark shape. A figure, not as tall as the one from the cabin, but still far too tall to be human. The same long limbs, not the same unsettling presence. It moved, stepping closer. Tap, tap, tap. I couldn't breathe. My legs went beneath me, and I fell to the floor, scrambling away from it. The figure didn't rush, didn't seem in any hurry. It moved slowly, as though savoring every moment of my terror. I crawled backward, knocking over furniture, desperate to get away from it, but the figure kept advancing. Every time I looked away, it was closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was silent. The tapping stopped. I don't know how long I sat there, huddled on the floor. But when I finally looked around, the figure was gone, as though it had never been there at all. The tapping had stopped. The house was still. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was a dream or if the cabin had somehow changed something in me. But I haven't been able to sleep since. Every night, when the clock strikes midnight, I hear the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. And it's always coming from somewhere just out of sight. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was a quiet evening in late October when Clara decided to visit her childhood home. The house stood at the edge of the woods on the outskirts of a small town. It had been abandoned for years after her parents passed away, but Clara had never been able to part with it. Over the years, she had visited occasionally, cleaning up, but it never felt the same. The silence in the house seemed too thick, almost oppressive, as if it was holding something back. That night, the chill of autumn had settled in, and Clara's thoughts had been wandering back to her parents and the house. She needed closure, something to help her let go of the memories that still haunted her. The road to the house was narrow and winding, lined with trees that seemed to close in as the sky darkened. Clara's headlights barely cut through the thick fog that clung to the ground. She tried to push the unsettling feeling in her chest away, but it lingered, gnawing at her. The air felt different, charged with something she couldn't explain. When Clara finally reached the house, the familiar sight of it made her stomach churn. It had once been a home full of warmth and love, but now, the broken windows and sagging roof gave it a ghostly appearance. The house seemed to sag under the weight of time and neglect. She stepped out of the car and walked slowly to the front door. The porch creaked under her feet, and the air around her seemed still, unnaturally so. The door, which she had left locked during her last visit, was ajar. She frowned but pushed it open and stepped inside. The house smelled of dust and old wood. The floorboards creaked beneath her as she made her way through the dimly lit hallway. She ran a hand along the banister, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingers. The living room lay ahead, the old fireplace still standing like a silent monument to the past. Her heart ached with nostalgia. But as she stepped further inside, something felt off, something she couldn't place. The walls were covered with faded wallpaper, and the furniture, once a symbol of her parents' love and care, was now reduced to a pile of rotting wood and fabric. There was a coldness in the room, and the silence weighed heavily on her. She could feel it now, the presence of something unseen. Clara shook her head, trying to dispel the thoughts that were creeping into her mind. It had been years since she had been back here, and her emotions were running high. She needed closure, she reminded herself. She made her way upstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway was even darker up here, and she could barely make out the door to her old bedroom at the far end. But there was something in the hallway that caught her attention. A small, ornate mirror hanging on the wall. Clara paused in front of the mirror. It was an old thing, one her mother had always kept polished, always saying it was a family heirloom. But now the glass was covered in grime and the edges were chipped. As she looked at her reflection, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Behind her, in the shadowy corner of the hallway, stood a figure. A person, faint but unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she thought she might faint. But when she turned around, the corner was empty. Her heart raced as she backed away from the mirror, her eyes never leaving the spot where she had seen the figure. Clara's mind raced. It must have been her imagination. She had been alone here for too long, the silence and the memories playing tricks on her. She tried to steady herself, but the air around her felt heavy, oppressive. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. She continued toward her bedroom, but the moment she stepped inside, she was hit with a wave of emotion. The room hadn't changed much since she was a child, except for the layer of dust that had accumulated over the years. The bed was still in the corner, the window still framed with faded curtains, but the room felt different now, darker. Clara moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside, staring out at the overgrown yard. The trees in the distance looked black against the dimming sky, their branches twisted and reaching toward the house like skeletal hands. She felt eyes on her back. Without thinking, she turned toward the door. That was when she saw it, a figure standing in the doorway. The same figure from the hallway mirror, only this time it wasn't a reflection. It was real. A man, tall and thin, his face hidden in shadow. His clothes were tattered, and he stood motionless, as though waiting. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. Her mouth went dry, and she tried to move, but her feet wouldn't respond. She was paralyzed with fear. The figure didn't speak, didn't move. He just stood there watching her. Then, from somewhere in the house, she heard it. A soft, distant sound. A creaking, followed by a slow, rhythmic thud, like footsteps moving across the floor above her. But there was no one else here. Clara's breathing quickened as the sound grew louder, closer, until it was right behind her. She spun around, her eyes frantically searching the room, but the figure was gone. The footsteps stopped, and all was silent again. But the air in the room felt different, colder, as if something unseen was present. Clara backed toward the door, her mind racing. She needed to get out of the house. Her pulse was hammering in her ears as she turned to leave, but as she reached for the doorknob, she heard something else. A whisper. Soft, barely audible. Clara. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, her hand still on the knob. The voice was familiar. It was her mother's voice, calling her name from the dark corners of the house. Clara's throat tightened and her mind screamed at her to leave, but she couldn't move. Her feet were glued to the floor. The whisper came again, louder this time. Clara? She spun around, and there, standing in the doorway, was her mother. But not like she remembered her. Her mother's figure was translucent, fading, her face twisted with a sorrowful expression that Clara had never seen before. Her once warm eyes were hollow and empty, and her mouth moved soundlessly. "Mom?" Clara whispered, stepping forward, her voice trembling. But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to fade, dissolving into the shadows, leaving Clara standing in the doorway of her bedroom, alone. Tears welled up in her eyes as the reality of what was happening hit her. She had always suspected that the house was more than just a place of memories, that it held something darker, something beyond the realm of explanation. But she had never wanted to believe it. She turned and ran out of the room, down the stairs, and out the front door, not looking back. The chill of the night air hit her face as she stumbled toward her car. She fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine, her hands shaking. She sped down the road, not stopping until she was far away from the house, from the figure, from the whispers. When Clara finally reached her apartment, she sat in the car for a long time, trying to catch her breath. She could still feel the weight of the house on her, the presence that had followed her. And in the dead of night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again. The whisper. Clara. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The first time I heard about the house was from a friend of mine who had been working as a realtor for a few months. She mentioned a property that no one had dared to buy for years. A house out in the country, far from any neighbors, surrounded by trees, with a long history that seemed to haunt it more than the old walls ever could. It was one of those places people spoke of in hushed tones. A house with rumors, whispers of strange noises at night, flickering lights when no one was home, and a strange chill in the air that even summer couldn't dispel. As soon as she told me, I was intrigued. I didn't believe in ghosts, at least not the way others did. I thought people were just looking for meaning where there was none, or letting their imaginations run wild. The idea of a house being haunted seemed so out of place, so absurd to me. My curiosity grew, and the more I heard about the house, the more I wanted to see it for myself. I agreed to meet with my friend one evening to visit the house. It was late autumn, and the sun was setting quickly as we drove down the long, winding road that led to the property. My friend didn't seem very eager about showing me the house, but she said she was just tired from work. I had never been to this part of town before, and I couldn't help but feel a strange unease settle in as we turned off the main road and onto a narrow dirt path that led to the house. It was dark by the time we reached the driveway, the sky painted in deep shades of purple and blue, and the wind was beginning to pick up, rustling the bare branches of the trees that surrounded the property. The house stood at the end of the long, overgrown driveway, casting a shadow against the darkening sky. It was an old Victorian-style home with a large wraparound porch and tall, narrow windows. Even from the outside, there was something unsettling about it. The porch creaked in the wind, and the whole house seemed to groan under the weight of the years. There was a feeling of neglect, but also something else, something I couldn't quite place, something that made my skin crawl. "Here we are," my friend said, her voice low, almost as if she were afraid to disturb the silence. I nodded, trying to shake the sense of dread that was creeping up my spine. We got out of the car, and as I stepped onto the gravel, I noticed how the wind seemed to pick up even more, as though it were whispering through the trees. The house loomed above us, its windows dark, with the exception of one light flickering faintly from the second floor. "Is the power still on?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. "Yeah," my friend replied. "But the lights, they tend to flicker sometimes, especially at night." We walked up the porch steps, and I could feel the boards creaking beneath my feet, as if the house were alive, reacting to our presence. The door was old and heavy, and when my friend pushed it open, it gave a loud groan, as if it hadn't been used in years. The smell of dust and mildew immediately hit me, and I took a deep breath, feeling the air heavy with the scent of abandonment. "Come on in," she said, stepping inside. I followed her into the house, my footsteps echoing through the empty hall. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in places, and the furniture was draped in white sheets, as though the house had been frozen in time. The whole place had a sense of quiet loneliness, as though no one had lived there for decades. The dim light from the flickering lamp in the corner of the room barely illuminated the space. My friend led me through the house, showing me the large, empty rooms, each one colder than the last. The air was thick with dust, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat as I moved from room to room, the silence pressing in on me. We reached the staircase at the end of the hall. It was narrow and steep, winding up to the second floor. There was a faint light at the top of the stairs, but the rest of the house above was cloaked in shadow. "Is that light on up there?" I asked. "Yeah, the light in the hallway upstairs flickers. It's nothing," my friend replied, though her voice had a slight tremor to it. Let's go check it out." I wasn't sure why, but something told me that I should stay on the first floor. There was something about the second floor that felt off, as though something was waiting for us up there. But I followed her anyway, trying to ignore the strange sense of foreboding building in my chest. As we climbed the stairs, the temperature seemed to drop, and I could see my breath in front of me. The wind howled outside, and the old house seemed to groan and creak in response, like it was settling deeper into the earth. The light at the top of the stairs flickered once more, casting an eerie glow across the hallway. We reached the top of the stairs, and I hesitated, feeling an overwhelming urge to turn around and leave. The house felt too still, too silent, as though it was waiting for something. My friend walked ahead of me, her footsteps echoing in the hallway. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. As we walked down the hallway, I noticed a door at the far end, slightly ajar. The light from the flickering lamp bathed the doorway in a pale glow. My heart started to race. "That's the master bedroom," my friend said, but her voice sounded distant, like she was lost in thought. It's where things have happened." I turned to look at her, confused. "What do you mean, things?" She seemed to hesitate for a moment, her eyes darting toward the door. "People say they hear things at night, strange noises, whispers, and sometimes the door will creak open by itself." "Isn't that normal for an old house?" I asked, trying to dismiss the tension that was building in my chest. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for the door and slowly pushed it open. The room was dark, but there was an old four-poster bed in the center, draped in heavy, dark curtains. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature had dropped even further. The floorboards groaned as I stepped inside, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "See," my friend said quietly, "this is where it happens." I didn't understand what she meant until I heard it. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the far corner of the room. It was a tapping noise, slow, rhythmic, like fingers tapping against wood. My blood ran cold. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. My friend nodded, her face pale. "It happens every night. The tapping. We don't know what it is, but some people say it's the sound of someone who never left." The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was coming from the corner of the room where the shadows were deepest. I turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just the faint outline of a chair, the shadows shifting in the dim light. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to my friend, my voice panicked. "We need to go. Right now." She didn't answer. She was staring at the corner, her eyes wide with fear, her mouth slightly open, as if she had seen something I couldn't. I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the door, but as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut on its own with a deafening bang. We froze. The tapping had stopped, but the room felt colder, darker, and then we heard it, a whisper, faint but clear, coming from the corner of the room. "Get out." I didn't wait to hear more. I grabbed the door handle and yanked with all my strength, finally forcing it open. We stumbled out into the hallway, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and I didn't stop until we were back downstairs, out of the house, and into the car. As we drove away, the house loomed behind us, dark and silent. I could still feel the weight of it pressing against me, the tapping echoing in my mind. My friend didn't say much after that, but I could tell she was just as shaken as I was. We didn't speak again about the house, but I knew I'd never forget the feeling of being there. The sense that something had been waiting, something that had never left. To this day, I can still hear that tapping in the back of my mind, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind picks up.
Story number 6.
The moon was barely visible behind the thick blanket of clouds as Sarah drove down the narrow, winding road. Her headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the occasional silhouette of trees lining the side of the road. It had been a long day, and she was eager to reach her new home, an old farmhouse just outside of town. She had inherited it from her aunt, who had passed away unexpectedly a few weeks earlier. The house had been vacant for years, and Sarah had decided it was time to move in, to start fresh, away from the bustling city life. As she neared the house, a strange sense of unease began to settle in her chest. The house loomed in the distance, its weathered facade barely visible through the fog that had started to roll in from the nearby woods. The eerie silence of the night seemed to press against the windows of her car, making her feel as though the world outside had vanished entirely. She pulled into the gravel driveway, the tires crunching under the weight of the car. The house looked even more imposing up close, its sagging roof, the broken windows, the overgrown garden. It was the kind of place you could imagine stories about. Stories that came to life when the sun set and the wind howled through the trees. Sarah shook off the thought. It was just a house. Her house now. She parked the car, grabbed her bag, and stepped out, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air was colder than she had expected, and she wrapped her coat tighter around herself as she approached the front door. The old key her aunt had given her felt heavy in her hand as she unlocked the door. Inside, the house was quiet. The air smelled of dust and decay, and the faint creaking of the floorboards echoed in the stillness. She flicked on the light, but the bulb buzzed and flickered before settling into a dim, yellow glow. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her a sense of comfort. The living room was sparse, with only a few pieces of furniture: a dusty armchair, a small table, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. There were photographs on the mantelpiece, most of them faded and yellowed with age. Sarah ran her fingers over the edges of the frames, her gaze lingering on one photo in particular. It was of her aunt, standing in front of the house with a smile on her face. Sarah had never known her aunt to be particularly cheerful, so seeing this image was a surprise. A sudden shiver ran down her spine as she heard the soft sound of the wind outside. She glanced around, but everything seemed still. She shrugged it off and made her way to the staircase. The upstairs was where her aunt had lived, and where Sarah would be staying for the time being. She climbed the stairs slowly, the old wood creaking beneath her weight. At the top of the stairs, she stood in front of the door to her aunt's bedroom. She hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The room was much like the rest of the house, dark, quiet, and filled with the scent of age. The bed was covered in a faded quilt, and the dresser was cluttered with knickknacks. But what caught Sarah's attention was the mirror on the wall. It was large, framed in dark wood, and it seemed to draw her in. She didn't know why, but as she stood there staring at her reflection, she felt a strange sensation, as though the air around her was thickening, pressing in on her. She shook her head and stepped back, dismissing the feeling as nothing more than nerves. She hadn't been alone in a house this big before, and it was only natural to feel a little on edge. She set her bag down on the bed and began unpacking, trying to push the unease from her mind. The house was old, yes, but it was also hers now, and there was no reason to be afraid. She had to be strong for herself and for her family. But as she started to settle in, something strange began to happen. The house seemed to creak and groan around her as though it was alive. At first, it was just the wind, rattling the windows, but then it grew louder, more pronounced. Footsteps, faint at first, then growing clearer, like someone walking through the house. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She froze, listening. The footsteps were coming from downstairs. Slowly, she got up and tiptoed to the top of the stairs, peering down into the darkened hallway below. The sound of footsteps stopped. She waited, heart pounding in her chest. The silence stretched on, and just when she thought it was safe, she heard it, a soft whisper, as though someone was speaking just beyond the reach of her hearing. Sarah, her name, faint but unmistakable. She froze, not daring to move. The whisper came again, closer this time. Sarah? Her pulse quickened. She stepped back from the stairs and turned to face the empty room. She knew she had heard something. She couldn't explain it, but it was real. The room suddenly felt colder, and the air seemed heavier, as though it was pressing down on her. She moved to the door and peered down the hallway again, her heart thudding in her chest. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched lingered, and the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She shut the door behind her and locked it, trying to steady her breathing. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her, the isolation making her hear things. But deep down, she knew there was something more to it. The night dragged on, and Sarah eventually lay down in the bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The house was still, but the sense of unease remained. The whispering didn't return, but the footsteps continued, soft and constant, moving through the house. She pulled the covers tighter around herself, wishing for morning to come, wishing for the darkness to recede. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the curtains, Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She slowly got out of bed, her body stiff from the unease of the night before. She made her way downstairs, determined to make herself some breakfast and push the strange events from her mind. As she walked into the kitchen, she was startled to find the door to the cellar wide open. She could have sworn she had closed it last night, but now it stood ajar, dark and foreboding. Her heart skipped a beat, and she hesitated before stepping toward the door. The air around her seemed to grow colder, and the whispering from the night before returned, faint but undeniable. Sarah? This time, it was clearer, more urgent. She took a step back, her mind racing. The house, her aunt's house, was hiding something, and it wasn't ready to let her go. The door to the cellar creaked open wider on its own, as though inviting her in. With trembling hands, Sarah backed away, the whispering growing louder in her ears. She knew now that she was not alone in the house. Something, someone, was still here, and it wasn't going to let her leave. Story, the end.
Story number 7.
I've never been a firm believer in the supernatural. Growing up, I was always skeptical of ghost stories, chalking them up to overactive imaginations or people just wanting attention. But that was before I moved to the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It was a good deal, really. The house had a lot of charm. High ceilings, wide windows, a large kitchen, and a wraparound porch. The price was right too, so I took it. The realtor never mentioned anything about the house's history, just that it was quiet and peaceful. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked, cleaned, and got the place in order, but something felt off. It wasn't the house itself. There was no sign of decay or disrepair. It was the way the air felt inside. Heavy. Still. As though the house was holding its breath. One night, about a week after I moved in, I stayed up late trying to get through some paperwork. It was well past midnight when I finished, and I decided to go to bed. I switched off the lights and laid down, but sleep didn't come as easily as usual. The house was unusually quiet. No cars passing by on the road outside, no sound of the wind rustling the trees, just an eerie, almost unnatural silence. Then, I heard it. At first it was faint, just a soft creak, like a floorboard groaning under pressure. I told myself it was just the house settling. After all, it was an old building. But then it came again. A distinct tap followed by another tap a few moments later. It sounded like someone was walking in the hall outside my bedroom. The sound of footsteps was light, uneven, almost hesitant. I sat up, straining to listen. The taps came again, slow and deliberate. Someone was walking around in the dark, but the house was empty. I knew that for sure. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to check it out. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon, perhaps, picking at something outside. I grabbed a flashlight, swung my legs over the side of the bed, and stood up. The cold air hit me immediately, and I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself. I moved cautiously into the hallway, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was nothing unusual at first glance. The house was still and silent, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stepped carefully toward the staircase that led to the second floor. The stairs creaked under my weight. The tapping sound continued, now louder, closer. It seemed to come from the bottom of the stairs, just out of sight in the darkness. I swallowed hard. I was beginning to feel foolish, but there was something undeniably unsettling about the noise. It wasn't random. It was too methodical, too purposeful. I turned the corner and aimed the flashlight toward the bottom of the stairs. The light flickered for a moment, and then I saw it. A shadow. A tall figure standing at the foot of the stairs. My heart froze. I could barely breathe. The shadow was long and distorted, like it had no true form. It seemed to bend in ways that didn't make sense, stretching unnaturally against the walls. I didn't move. I couldn't move. The figure stood there, silent, not even making a sound. Then, as if it had been aware of my presence all along, the shadow shifted, just a little, and started moving toward me. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, until it was like someone was walking directly at me, but no one was there. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, and fled back into my bedroom. I slammed the door shut behind me and pressed my back against it, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was still again, eerily quiet. My breathing was the only sound, ragged and uneven. I lay in bed for hours that night, too terrified to sleep, listening for any sign of movement. But the house remained silent. The tapping stopped. The shadow, whatever it had been, didn't return. The next day I told myself I was just tired. Maybe I'd been imagining things. Old houses have a way of playing tricks on your mind, especially when you're alone in the dark. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The silence seemed heavier, and I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the corner of my vision. That evening, I decided to go into town to get some groceries. I needed to clear my head. As I was loading my car with the bags, I noticed an older woman walking by. She had a weathered face with deep lines that seemed to tell stories, and her eyes were sharp, almost too sharp. She gave me a strange look as she passed, and then she stopped. "You're living in that house, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low and gravelly. I nodded, unsure of what to say. She stared at me for a long moment, then sighed, her expression darkening. "You should leave. Don't stay there. It's not safe." I felt a cold chill run through me, but I forced a smile. "I'm sure it's fine. Just an old house. No reason to worry." She shook her head. No, it's not just an old house. It's cursed. There's something in there. It's been waiting." Before I could ask her what she meant, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the distance without another word. I stood there, frozen in place, the bag still in my hands. What had she meant? What was waiting in the house? I didn't go back that night. I stayed at a friend's house, and when I returned the next morning, everything seemed normal again. But the silence still pressed against me, and I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. That evening, when the sun began to set, I decided to try and sleep in the house again. I had to know if what I'd heard was real or just my imagination playing tricks on me. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the world outside grew dark. I sat in the living room, the only light coming from the fireplace. The crackling of the flames was the only sound, and yet as the night wore on, the tapping began again. Soft, almost inaudible at first, but then louder, more deliberate. Tap! I stood, my heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table. Tap! I crept toward the stairs, my breath catching in my throat. The sound grew louder, echoing in the empty house. My steps were slow, cautious, and when I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard it again. This time the sound came from the hallway behind me. I spun around. There at the far end of the hallway stood the figure again. The same shadow, just as tall, just as distorted, but this time it was closer. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. The air turned icy. My breath was visible in front of me, a cloud of vapor that hung in the air. I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor, my body paralyzed by fear. I could hear the figure's slow, deliberate breathing, though it made no sound, and then it whispered, "Leave." The voice was a rasp, a dry, cracked sound like it hadn't been used in years. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced myself to take a step back, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadow. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My mind raced with every possible explanation. Nothing made sense. And yet, nothing seemed real anymore. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in that moment, but eventually the figure faded. The tapping stopped. The coldness disappeared. I didn't sleep that night or the night after. The house felt different now. Heavier, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. I didn't stay much longer. I couldn't. I packed up my things and left, leaving the house behind. I never went back, and I never will. Sometimes when I lie awake at night, I still hear the tapping. Sometimes I feel the weight of those eyes watching me from the shadows. And I know, somewhere out there, it's still waiting. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was late autumn when I first moved into the old house at the edge of town. The place was nothing special on the outside, just a run-down, 2-story farmhouse with peeling white paint and a sagging roof. But it was cheap, and after a recent breakup, I needed somewhere quiet to start over. The landlord didn't ask many questions, which suited me just fine. I signed the lease and moved in, not thinking much of it. The first few nights were uneventful. I unpacked my things, settled into the small, modest rooms, and tried to adjust to the silence. The house had an odd smell to it, a mix of dust and something older, something I couldn't quite place. But I was used to that. Old houses had their smells, right? I remember the first time I felt like something wasn't right. It was around midnight, the dead of night, when I woke to the sound of someone, walking around upstairs. I lay in my bed, straining my ears, trying to make sense of it. The sound was faint, but it was there. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and echoing through the empty rooms. I told myself it was just the house settling, that old houses creak and groan. Maybe it was the wind rattling the windows, but something about it felt off. The footsteps weren't random. They were measured, almost like someone was pacing back and forth. I tried to ignore it, but sleep didn't come easily after that. I spent the next few hours staring at the ceiling, like too uneasy to close my eyes, my mind racing. The sound of footsteps persisted. Every so often, I thought I heard a faint creak like a door opening or closing, but I was too afraid to get up and check. I convinced myself that it was all in my head. The next morning, I went about my usual routine. I convinced myself that I'd imagined it all, just the stress from the move, perhaps, or my anxiety acting up. But that night, the footsteps came again. At first, it was quiet. A soft, almost imperceptible sound like the light tapping of shoes against the floorboards. Then, louder, more deliberate. Someone was walking upstairs, pacing the length of the hallway. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. My bedroom was on the ground floor, and the upstairs hallway was dark, almost suffocatingly so. But I couldn't see anyone through the ceiling. I tried to shake off the panic rising in my chest. This was just my mind playing tricks on me, I thought. I needed to be stronger than this. But when the sound continued, slow, methodical, I felt the undeniable urge to go upstairs. Maybe there was an intruder in the house. Maybe I'd missed a window open when I moved in. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly made my way upstairs. The house was unnaturally cold, and the darkness felt thick. The hallway stretched out in front of me like a black tunnel. I took a deep breath and walked toward the source of the noise. The footsteps stopped, but the air remained heavy, as though something were waiting for me. I reached the top of the stairs and scanned the dark hallway. Nothing. No sign of anyone. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I turned the corner to check the rooms, but everything seemed in order. There was no sign of a break-in, no evidence that anyone had been there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked the door to the spare room at the end of the hall. It was locked, and when I turned the knob, it didn't budge. I had the strangest feeling that whatever I was looking for was inside, but I had no choice. I couldn't shake the sensation that I needed to find out what was causing the noise. After what felt like an eternity, I gave up and went back downstairs, my footsteps heavy with dread. The silence returned as soon as I descended the last step, and I stood in the living room, trying to steady my breath. The house felt like a different place now, darker somehow, as though it was aware of me, of my fear. The days passed, but the footsteps never stopped. Every night, without fail, I would hear the same pacing, the same slow, deliberate steps. It never felt like something natural. It felt like a presence, an entity was moving through the house. I began to feel like I wasn't alone, like something was watching me. There were nights when the footsteps seemed to follow me, moving just out of sight. Sometimes I'd hear the door creak open, but when I checked, no one was there. Just the same old, empty rooms. I became increasingly paranoid, avoiding the second floor as much as possible. I kept the lights on in every room and closed the door to the hallway at night, hoping it would block out the noises. But no matter what I did, the footsteps came every night. The pacing, the faint creaks and taps, and every time I thought it had stopped, it started again. One night, when I couldn't stand it anymore, I decided to confront it. I couldn't let fear control me. I needed to know what was going on. I got up from my bed, my heart racing, and made my way to the stairs. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I climbed the stairs, my feet echoing loudly in the otherwise quiet house. The upstairs was darker than usual. The air felt colder, almost as if something was waiting in the shadows. I stepped into the hallway, determined to find the source of the sound once and for all. My eyes darted from door to door, my pulse racing. When I reached the farthest room, the spare room at the end of the hall, I noticed something new. The door wasn't locked this time. It stood ajar, slightly open as though inviting me in. I hesitated, my breath shallow. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to know what was in that room. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick, like I had entered a different world altogether. The room was empty, but there was a strange energy in the space, something palpable, something that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I scanned the room, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. And then I saw it. At the far side of the room, next to the window, was a chair. It was old, dusty, and worn, but that wasn't what caught my attention. What caught my attention was the figure sitting in it. I froze. The figure was blurry, indistinct at first, like a shadow made of smoke. It had no discernible features, just a vague outline of a person. It was sitting still, not moving, but I could feel its gaze on me, even though it had no face. My heart thudded in my chest, and my knees felt weak. For what felt like an eternity, I couldn't move. I just stared at the figure, my mind racing, my body paralyzed with fear. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but somehow, I knew it was waiting for me to leave. And as the seconds passed, I realized that I had to go. I had to leave. I wasn't supposed to be here. I turned around quickly and bolted down the stairs. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The footsteps stopped, but the air remained heavy, thick with an ominous presence. I locked every door, shut every window, and stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the blanket around me. I never went back upstairs again after that. I couldn't bring myself to. Something in that room, the figure, whatever it was, had made it clear that I wasn't welcome. The footsteps never came again, but I could feel the house watching me, waiting for me to leave, and I did. I packed up my things a few weeks later, left the house behind, and moved far away from that place. But to this day, I can still hear the footsteps sometimes echoing in the dead of night. Story, the end.
Story number 9.
The house had always been quiet, too quiet. But that night, it felt suffocating. As Emily sat alone in her grandmother's old armchair by the window, the night outside seemed to press against the house, pressing the silence into every corner. Her grandmother had passed away a month ago, leaving Emily with this inherited house, old and worn, full of the faint smell of stale wood and dust. It was all that Emily had left now, and while it wasn't a place she had grown up in, it held memories of the woman who had raised her when her parents weren't around. The house stood at the edge of a small town, far from the bustle of city life, tucked behind an overgrown garden and a tall iron fence. Over the years, Emily had learned to accept the stillness, to let it wash over her like an old song, familiar and constant. But tonight, it felt different. The stillness was not comforting. It was oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. She glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. It was 2:03 a.m. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rustling the leaves. The old house creaked and groaned under the weight of time, but in the silence of the dead of night, every sound seemed amplified. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to ward off the chill that had settled into the bones of the house. The fire in the fireplace crackled, sending little sparks into the air. The warmth was comforting, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had never been one to believe in ghosts, at least not until recently. Her grandmother had always warned her to be careful when the nights were still, when the house was too quiet. "You'll hear things," her grandmother had said, "and you might see things, too." Emily had dismissed it then. She had thought it was just the ramblings of an old woman. But now, as she sat in the darkened room, the hair on the back of her neck prickled. She could feel the weight of the house pressing in on her, feel eyes watching her from somewhere just beyond the flickering light. She forced herself to stand, shaking off the unease that threatened to take over. The house was old, the beams settling, the pipes groaning, nothing more. It was just her imagination running wild. She made her way to the kitchen, hoping a cup of tea would calm her nerves. As she passed through the hallway, she heard a faint sound, something she couldn't quite place. It was the softest of taps, a sound so small it could have been the house settling. But it wasn't. It was too deliberate. Emily stopped in her tracks. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway behind her was empty, the shadows long and still. She shook her head, berating herself for being jumpy. It was just the house, she told herself, trying to ignore the growing feeling of dread that settled in her gut. She continued to the kitchen, but the silence followed her, pressing down on her like a heavy weight. As she poured hot water into a mug, the soft tapping came again, closer this time. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't the house settling, it wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. The unmistakable sound of someone walking, moving just behind her, slow and deliberate, as if they were waiting for her to notice. Emily turned, her heart racing. but there was no one there. The kitchen was empty, the shadows gathering in the corners like they always did. She took a step back, her eyes darting around the room. The tapping continued, just beyond the kitchen door, as if someone was standing in the hallway, waiting. She didn't know what to do. Part of her wanted to scream, to run out of the house and never look back, but another part of her felt frozen, paralyzed by the sense that something was about to happen. Something was already happening. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and Emily felt a coldness creep up her spine. She didn't want to turn around, but she knew she had to. Slowly, her body trembling, she turned to face the hallway. And there, standing at the far end, was a figure. A shadow, darker than the darkness around it, just beyond the light. She couldn't see its features, only the vague outline of a person, standing still and silent. Its presence filled the space, suffocating the air with an oppressive weight. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but she could feel its eyes on her, watching, waiting. A voice whispered from the depths of her memory, her grandmother's voice, faint but clear. In the dead of night, when the house is quiet, you might hear them. They're never far away. Emily's knees buckled beneath her, and she stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. She turned and ran out of the kitchen, her feet slamming against the floor as she made her way to the stairs. The house seemed to stretch on forever, each room feeling more distant, more isolated than the last. She reached the staircase and began to climb, not daring to look back. But as she reached the top of the stairs, she heard the tapping again, this time from behind her, moving up the stairs after her. It was slow at first, almost like it was waiting for her to turn around to acknowledge it, but the tapping grew louder, more frantic, as though the thing in the dark was growing impatient. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she bolted down the hallway to the bedroom. She locked the door behind her, her hands shaking as she gripped the handle. She leaned against the door, trying to steady her breath, her mind racing. What was it? What was following her? The house was silent again, too silent. The sound of her own breathing seemed deafening in the dark room. She stepped away from the door, turning to look around, but the shadows seemed to press closer, closing in on her from all sides. The bed creaked as though someone had just sat on it. The sound was so subtle, but it filled the room, sending a wave of terror over her. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her grandmother's warnings echoed in her ears, louder now, more urgent. They're never far away. The air in the room thickened, and Emily could feel it. A presence, something dark and malevolent. It was standing beside her, just out of reach, its cold breath brushing her skin. The whisper came again, so soft, so close. It was like it was right in her ear. Emily! She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, but the room was empty. The shadows loomed, but nothing moved. Still, she could feel the weight of the presence. Flue could feel the eyes on her. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to get out. She turned and ran to the window, throwing it open with trembling hands. The cold air rushed in, but she didn't care. She was going to leave. She had to leave. But as she climbed out onto the ledge, her foot slipped. She cried out as she stumbled, but then, just as quickly, a hand gripped her wrist, pulling her back into the room. There was no one there. The room was empty. It was all in her mind, wasn't it? The house, the whispers, the tapping, the shadows. She turned back to the bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure was there again, sitting on the edge of the bed, its face now visible. Hollow eyes stared back at her, empty and cold. And it spoke, its voice a rasping whisper, "You can never leave." Story the end.